I always thought my mother-in-law, Beatrice, was just a snob. I assumed she looked down on me because I hadn't grown up with a gated driveway or a silver spoon tucked neatly into a drawer. I believed her coldness was about class, about money, about the quiet ways wealthy people remind you that you don't belong. I was wrong. She didn't hate me for my background. She hated me because I was the only person standing between her and a federal prison cell. My name is Emily Carter, and 3 days ago I made a mistake that ended my marriage, but very likely saved my life. I forgot to tell Beatrice that I had installed a 360-degree motion-activated camera in the mudroom of my grandmother's cottage. I'd inherited Willow Creek just a month earlier. It was old, creaky, and miles from anything important, but it was the only place that had ever felt like home. When my husband, Julian, and I planned a short weekend trip to the city, Beatrice surprised me by offering to drive out and feed the chickens while we were gone. She was warm, helpful, almost pleasant. I remember thinking it was the first time she'd ever tried to meet me halfway. On Monday morning, still half asleep, I opened the security app on my phone. I wasn't expecting to see anything more than grain dust and feathers. Instead, I saw Beatrice. She was wearing a $1,000 trench coat, kneeling on the dusty floorboards with a crowbar in her hands. I watched, frozen, as she pried up the wood beneath the pantry and pulled out a tattered leather satchel. I recognized it immediately. It was the one my grandmother had pressed into my hands years ago, telling me it was my life insurance in case things ever got dark. My stomach dropped as I realized she knew exactly where it was. Terrified, shaking, and barely able to breathe, I did what any wife would do. I called my husband. I was crying so hard I could hardly form words. I told Julian his mother was in the cottage. I told him she was stealing from me. I told him I had everything on camera. And that's when the world went cold. Julian didn't ask if I was safe. He didn't sound confused or angry or even surprised. There was just a long, hollow silence on the line, the kind that swallows sound instead of waiting for it. Then he whispered, his voice tight with fear, "Emily, please, just stay away from the house. Delete the footage. Don't go there." Before I could respond, I heard another voice in the background of his phone. A voice that should have been impossible. It was deep and raspy, familiar in a way that made my blood run cold. A voice I had only ever heard in old home movies and faded family recordings. The voice said, "Is she handled yet? Give me the phone, Julian." That was the voice of Marcus Carter, Julian's father, the man who supposedly died in a car wreck 10 years ago. In that moment, I understood the truth. My husband wasn't just keeping a secret. He was protecting a ghost. To understand why they were willing to kill for a tattered leather bag, you have to understand Willow Creek. My grandmother, Rose, was a quiet woman. She didn't raise her voice and she never advertised her strength. But she was the sole owner of 40 acres of land that sat directly between two major state highways. To most people, it was just pasture and trees. To a developer, it was a gold mine. And to Beatrice Carter, it was the final chip in a game she was already losing. The Carters were old money, or at least they liked to appear that way. But after Marcus died in that river 10 years ago, the family fortune began to quietly evaporate. I didn't know it then, but Julian and I had been living on borrowed time. Every luxury we enjoyed, the apartment, the cars, the designer clothes Julian insisted I wear, was funded by something far darker than inheritance. It was all paid for by a massive insurance fraud scheme that began the day Marcus's car went into the water and his body never surfaced. Beatrice had spent nearly a decade trying to convince my grandmother to sign over the deed to Willow Creek. She tried kindness first, then pressure, then subtle threats wrapped in charm. But Rose was sharper than she looked. She saw straight through the pearls, the manicured hands, and the expensive smiles. On her deathbed, my grandmother gripped my hand with more strength than I thought she had left. She leaned in close and whispered, "Emily, the floorboards keep the truth. If the Carters ever come for the land, look where the light hits at noon." I thought it was delirium. I told myself it was just the rambling of a tired mind letting go. I was wrong. She wasn't confused. She was warning me. She was handing me the map to a conspiracy she'd been protecting for years. So when Beatrice offered to help last week, I wanted desperately to believe it was a peace offering. I wanted to believe that grief had softened her, that time had finally worn down the sharp edges between us. Julian encouraged it. He told me I deserved a break. He said his mother wanted to show she cared. Now I understand the truth. He wasn't giving me a vacation. He was clearing the house. Because while I was gone, his mother planned to finish what his father started 10 years ago. And this time, she didn't intend to leave any witnesses behind. After that phone call with Julian, I didn't go home. I couldn't. If my husband was in a room with a dead man, then I wasn't safe in our apartment. I sat in my car for hours, replaying the audio from the camera again and again. I watched Beatrice over and over. She wasn't just stealing, she was searching for something specific. I drove back to Willow Creek under the cover of a moonless night. I parked a mile away and hiked through the woods, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. When I reached the porch, the smell hit me first. Industrial bleach, sharp and overpowering. I let myself in through the cellar. Inside, the house felt violated. Beatrice had poured bleach over every shelf in the pantry. She'd destroyed my grandmother's handmade preserves, the jars I'd planned to keep for my own children. It felt deliberate, surgical, a targeted assassination of my memories. She wanted to erase every trace of Rose, the woman who knew their secret. I went straight to the mudroom. The floorboard was still askew. Beatrice had taken the leather satchel, but in her arrogance she hadn't checked the joists. I reached deep into the gap, my fingers brushing against cold metal, and pulled out a small blue ledger wrapped in plastic. This wasn't a diary. It was a record of every offshore transfer Marcus Carter had made in the 3 years leading up to his death. There were photos of his car, undamaged, sitting in a private garage in the city, dated a week after the accident was reported. My grandmother hadn't just been a bookkeeper. She had been the only person holding the receipts for the greatest fraud in the state's history. Then the floorboards groaned upstairs. 2 sets of footsteps. I barely had time to scramble into the pantry before the kitchen light flickered on. I peered through the crack in the pantry door and my breath hitched. It was Beatrice. And standing beside her, looking pale and exhausted, was Julian. "It's not here, Marcus," Beatrice hissed into her phone. "The girl must have found it. She mentioned a blue ledger when I spoke to her earlier. She's playing us." Then Marcus's voice boomed from the speakerphone. "Then find her. Julian, check the cellar. If she has that ledger, we aren't just looking at a lawsuit. We're looking at a life sentence. Do not let her leave this property." I watched my husband, the man I'd shared a bed with for 5 years, nod his head. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a coward. As he started toward the cellar door, the reality settled in. I was trapped. But here's the thing about being the ignored daughter-in-law. You learn to observe. I knew this house better than they did. I knew the back of the pantry had a removable panel that led to the old coal chute. I slipped through the panel just as Julian opened the cellar door. I crawled through the dark, cold chute and tumbled out onto the damp earth behind the house. I didn't run to the police. I couldn't. The Carters owned half the town, including the sheriff. If I walked into that station, the ledger would disappear, and I'd be the next one to have a tragic accident. I made it to my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type. I opened my laptop and connected to the cottage's satellite internet. In 2026, you don't need a lawyer to be heard. You need a platform. I hit broadcast on a national true crime livestream and titled it, "The Ghost of Marcus Carter, The Live Confession." I piped the audio from the cottage's hidden cameras straight into the stream. I held the blue ledger up to my webcam, slowly flipping through pages of offshore accounts and forged death certificates. Then I dialed Beatrice's cell phone. Beatrice picked up instantly. "Emily? Darling, where are you? We're so worried." "I'm looking at you, Beatrice," I said, my voice vibrating with a strength I didn't know I had. "I'm looking at the man standing next to you. The one who died 10 years ago. Say hello to the 70,000 people watching this live stream, Marcus. The feds have been pinging your location for the last 10 minutes. The silence on the other end was deafening. I heard Julian gasp. Then I heard the phone drop to the floor. "Emily, stop!" Julian yelled somewhere in the background. "We can settle this. We can give you the land. We can give you $10 million. You don't have $10 million, Julian," I said calmly. "You have a pile of debt and a father who's a felon. It's over." Then Marcus picked up the phone. His voice was cold. "You think you've won, Emily?" he said. "You think your grandmother was an innocent victim? Why do you think she kept that ledger? She wasn't a bookkeeper. She was my partner. She helped me vanish because she wanted a cut of the insurance." I felt the ground shift beneath me. "That land isn't yours because she loved you," Marcus continued. "It's yours because it's the only place the harvest is buried. Why do you think she told you to look where the light hits at noon? Under the apricot trees, Emily. That's where the real proof is. And if I'm going down, your grandmother's legacy is going down with me." I didn't believe him. But as the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, I found myself looking toward the apricot trees at the edge of the property. The FBI moved in like a tidal wave. They didn't care about the local sheriff's connections. They had Marcus Carter on a live feed, confirming he was alive and confirming a decade of federal crimes. I watched from the edge of the woods as they were dragged out in zip ties. Beatrice was screaming about her reputation. Marcus was silent, staring at me with a look of pure venom. Julian just cried. He looked at me one last time, a silent plea for help in his eyes. I turned away. The harvest Marcus mentioned was real. The next morning, federal recovery teams unearthed $3 million in vacuum-sealed cash, along with 4 paintings that had been stolen from a London gallery 20 years ago. My grandmother hadn't just been a victim. She had been the vault. She kept the Carters' secrets because she was the only one who knew where the money was buried. But she left the ledger for me. Maybe it was her way of apologizing. It's been 6 months since the Carter conspiracy broke the internet. Beatrice is now facing 15 years. Marcus is in a federal facility for the rest of his life. Julian didn't go to prison, but he lost everything. I made sure of that in the divorce. I kept Willow Creek. I cleaned the bleach out of the pantry. I didn't keep the money, it was all seized, but I kept the land. And looking back now, I have to ask you something. What would you have done? Would you have stayed silent to protect your husband? Or would you have done what I did and exposed the truth to the world? I've been called a hero. I've been called a traitor. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. My marriage was a lie. My husband was a ghost, but the camera doesn't lie. And believe me, I will never forget to tell anyone about the cameras ever again. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, please leave a like and subscribe for more deep dive narratives. Stay safe out there. And remember, someone is always watching.